In this lecture, I'll be introducing the environment, environmental issues as a whole, as an introduction also to biodiversity, issues of climate change that we'll be discussing in the next section here. So overall, this section, we're going to look at a number of different things. We're going to look at what exactly is meant by environmental from a lay perspective, as well as from an environmental anthropology perspective. We'll look at the conflicting notions of conservation and preservation in the United States, both historically, but we might also consider how some vestiges of this are still around today. We'll consider the science of ecology. This will be discussed in further detail in the film All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, the use and abuse of vegetational concepts. We'll look at the rise of the environmental movement, particularly in the United States and then globally, looking at environmental law and policy over the last several decades. And I'll point out a couple case studies, one by Bilal Butt, who did his work on the safari in Kenya, and some of my work in looking at Tox Island Dam and what has become the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. So to start off, we might ask ourselves what it is that we mean by environmental. And depending on your definition of the environment and how you conceptualize our place in the environment, are humans in fact a part of the environment? Are we part and parcel of the environment? Or are we apart from the environment? That is something that is distinct about human beings that makes us separate from the environment. And then how do we realize aesthetically pleasing environments versus environments which might not be as aesthetically pleasing? And I mentioned this when we were talking about food security issues, and I was talking about the work on fresh fruit, broken bodies. And in that piece, how migrant farm workers looked at the beautiful Skagit Valley, and they saw something very different from the lush mountains and the wildlife and the beautiful sun and clouds and whatnot. Very green, very verdant environment, but they didn't see the same sense of aesthetics that a tourist might see in the particular setting. So in the United States, there's what has framed a lot of the discussions around environmental issues has been the issue of resource utilization. And there are two main figures historically that have informed a lot of policy and a lot of the different directions that both the formal environmental organizations within the government have taken, as well as non-government organizations. And of course, environmental organizations exist along a complete spectrum of different approaches to the environment themselves. We have Gifford Pinchot, who follows the idea of the multiple use, sustained yield concept. His vision was very utilitarian in terms of dealing with nature, that nature was something that was fundamentally for human beings. And it had to be utilized, but it had to be utilized in a wise manner, that we could make intelligent decisions about managing resources for the benefit not only of mankind, all of mankind or humankind today, but also going forward into future generations. And a lot of this was Pinchot's background in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area in Milford, Pennsylvania, where he saw a lot of the deforestation that was taking place around him, and indeed his father and grandfather had been involved in a lot of the logging that was bringing logs down the Delaware and then out, floated essentially down the Delaware. And he was seeing the denuding of landscapes. And if you go up and you drive through Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area today, it might be easy to imagine this place was always very green, but indeed, during Pinchot's time, if you go up to Milford Knob and you go to what is today the Pinchot Mansion, as part of the U.S. Forest Service, the landscape was essentially denuded. You could see clear vistas without very much in the way in terms of trees or anything like that. So Pinchot was the first professional forester in the United States. He's associated with Yale. He was trained in Europe and becomes the first professional forester in the United States and becomes head of the Forest Service. Both he and John Muir competed for the ear of Roosevelt, and there were some heated exchanges about how nature should be thought about. John Muir was a preservationist. He is probably most well associated with the Sierras in California. He looked at the earth, preservation of the environment for the sake of the earth as a whole. And the model of doing this was an exclusionary model where humans wouldn't necessarily transgress, or if they did transgress, it would be much in the same lines of visits to wilderness areas, visits to natural areas that would connect us up to the environment as we were potentially fundamentally apart from it, and only through connection with the environment, communing with the environment, would we become a part of the environment. From the film, we saw a number of theorists talk about ecology. Arthur Tansley is noted for coining the term ecosystem. And during this time period in ecology, there was this notion of climax communities. That is, that nature was essentially working in lockstep fashion, and much like the unilineal evolutionists believed, the ecologists at the time believed that the environment itself, depending on the particular biome, the terrestrial ecosystem, was going towards some sort of climax or ultimate stage. So there was this notion of stability that would come in, this notion of homeostasis, and that ultimately things would balance out. And Jay Forster picks up on these ideas with cybernetics. And essentially, nature, under this idea, everything operates as a system. It's regulated by feedback loops. So nature is self-correcting. And these are some of the narratives potentially in contemporary environmental thought that we as human beings cannot possibly do anything to the earth because nature heals itself. In fact, I was out at the Drake oil well a couple summers back, and I was talking to one of the individuals out there, and they were very much of the idea and opinion that things like Oil Creek, that was essentially an environmental dead zone at the height of extraction, had come back and was indeed a great fishing creek nowadays, one of the best in Pennsylvania as a whole, and he had talked about this idea of nature healing itself. The Odom brothers, Eugene and Howard, were known for their work in systems analysis, and they intentionally used circuit boards as an analogy for explaining what was happening in the ecosystem. And so you had the idea of energy flow through the ecosystem and how it was conducted and how it moved through the ecosystem as a whole. And they had a number of feedback loops within this that showed essentially along the lines of electrical flow as a whole. Garrett Hardin is well known for his work on the tragedy of the commons, and this makes the he situates it in the context of paddocks in the UK, and essentially the argument goes is that you have, as individuals, you have so many head of cattle, and you have a common pool resource, which is essentially all of the foraging area. And as an individual, it makes sense to maximize your utility by sending as many cattle onto the common area, the common pool resource, and essentially denuding the landscape. You would, if everyone seeks to maximize their number of head of cattle, they are ultimately going to overextend the ability of the ecosystem to regenerate effectively and to maintain the number of cattle, animal units per given area. Now, one of the things that this excludes is any sort of mechanisms within culture, any sort of regulation within culture to control the extraction of resources overall. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a little bit. This ranges all the way from foraging societies all the way up to industrial agriculture, where you have farmers, for example, in Shorman and Haynes' piece along the Mississippi Delta, deliberately regulating themselves to prevent the incursion of government agents in the work that they're doing to grow food overall. So we see many mechanisms that are in place, either that do not exist in an institutional setting, whether this is in small scale foraging societies all the way up to industrial agriculture. So there are very deliberate decisions that are made by individuals that have a vested interest in maintaining the resource over long periods of time versus this notion of common pool resources. Uh, if we think about the notion of the environment as a whole, Wolfgang Sachs has come up with this notion of three different perspectives, which are good for framing the debates and discussions over the last 30 or 40 years concerning the environment as a whole. And these are fundamentally different perspectives on looking at the Earth as a whole. The first one is what's been termed, according to Sachs, as the contest perspective. And this essentially boils down to cost-benefit logic. Essentially, you have utilitarian arguments which are espoused here. Nature becomes a resource that is to be utilized. There is notion of development as something that lasts versus growth, and that the ultimate driver here, what ends up happening, is that the North should invest in the South for the long-term sustainability of the environment, the global ecosystem as a whole. So this is indeed a global management regimes where you have a bifurcation or a splitting into two of North and South, of resource flows from investment from the North into the South. Although historically, of course, you do have through colonialism and neocolonialism, the extraction of resources from so-called South countries or developing, the developing world, least developed world, less developed world, underdeveloped world, to the so-called higher developed, more developed, or sometimes even overdeveloped nations of the North as a whole. The second perspective is the astronaut's perspective. And this is the perspective that many people started to gravitate towards once a lot of the pictures started coming back from the moon, the Earthrise, and the realization of the relative isolation of planet Earth in the vastness and relative emptiness of space as a whole. And so there were discussions here about things like lifeboat ethics. This was, again, the time when a lot was made about population issues and overpopulation. The Spaceship Earth idea focuses, again, on lifeboat ethics, on triage, potentially. Research is big here. Big science is coming into play in order to solve global issues, things like climate modeling, and then the potential suggestions for required policy shifts that would go along with climate change overall. Here, in this perspective, the North essentially has the responsibility for all of the Earth. So that the North is essentially the manager of the planet as a whole through the utilization of science and policy to control the comings and goings of the global South. Overall, since they're in this paradigm, there's the notion of scarcity. The notion of economic development is somewhat tenuous given the relatively scarce resources that need to be distributed. Finally, the home perspective calls into mind the focus on local livelihoods. And here you have the notion of the maintenance of cultural traditions, the allowing of the passing of knowledge from one generation to the other through traditional ecological knowledge, through embodied knowledge, and through place-based knowledge. In this perspective, as Sachs argues, this considers the crisis of justice and equity in a way that the astronaut's perspective and the contest perspective do not. And here you have this notion of resistance against development, and particularly development that takes the form of top-down doctrines that are essentially dictated from the North to the South, either in terms of economic development, where the North invests in the South, or global science, where the North essentially